Thanks, Wendy. I think I'm supposed to sit here, right, Steve?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for coming, everyone. Let me get to the right page of sheet notes. More folks coming. Possible panelists. I'm one panel short, so we may have to press you into action. Tax Clark Dorner is not here yet. Anyway, we appreciate your coming. Today's event is a little unusual for us because it's almost an experiment. We usually, we do history, we do art, we do culture, and periodically we do some lecture or so forth on contemporary something. Well, this is kind of a mishmash. We're going to be talking about sharing stories, and I have a distinguished panel to help, of our recent experience, and of course everyone in the room I think has a Thomas Fire experience, so you got to formalize it a little bit, so I'll be bringing people up one or two at a time. But in addition, we'll be throwing in some historical context, because we are the Ojai Valley Museum, and we are also planning, as Wendy mentioned, I think she mentioned, we're planning an exhibit in the fall, which will also try to straddle these two, not entirely complementary concepts, at least often, which is to say a contemporary event, even next fall, this fire will still be rather fresh in our minds, and history. So we want to both provide historical context and bring it up to like yesterday, essentially. And it's not something we've necessarily done a lot, so we're sort of workshopping the idea a little bit today. So bear with us if some of the joints sort of show, because that's our basic idea. And one of the reasons we want to combine history and our recent experience, very recent history, is we want to provide context for the community to have the sorts of discussions that I think they're going to have going forward about trying to take the energy from what the community generated by coming together to deal with the Thomas Fire and maybe sort of spin it forward in some positive ways. And as a matter of fact, I think I will bring Peggy Lucera up, if you wouldn't mind, Peggy, because these are not, the museum exhibit is going to happen on November 17th, I believe, and some other things around that are happening. So let me have Peggy share that with you, and then we'll keep going.
Hi, everybody.
Have a seat, Peggy.
Okay. Have to get a ladder. Where are the firemen when you need them? So in November, centered around the museum's event, we're going to hold our first eco-education conference in Ojai, a group formed in the aftermath of the fire, initially looking at how to support our habitat, because there was a little bit of confusion. Do we feed the birds or don't we? Do we reseed or don't we? And so I called the Land Conservancy, the Green Coalition, Ojai Trees, the Raptor Center, Bob Roper, the former fire chief, insect pollinators, native plant people, and we all came together in a circle at Christine Golden, the art commissioner's home, and discussed what we were going to do about habitat restoration, and that fulminated into what is now going to be called the Ojai Valley Restoration and Resiliency Council. One of the visions is to have Ojai be a world center for eco-sustainability and use so that we all gather knowledge in a continuous way to be able to fortify our own community against fire, flood, earthquake, and drought, and to broaden the base of our economy so we can have docents that are showing people permaculture swales and how to build fire and earthquake resistant structures. And one of the thrusts is to change some of the codes, laws, and ordinances as quickly as possible so that we can do the kind of building that will be fire resistant. So this is coming up November 17th in conjunction with the Thomas Fire and Fires Past exhibit that's opening here at the museum. We're just scheduling them now, 4 to 8 talks about fortifying ourselves against fires in the future. And they'll be similar to Scorched Souls. There'll be an exhibit called Fireworks that night at the Arts Center, music, art, dance having to do with fire, photographs on the big screen, and I'm hoping to have fire stories at Libby Bowl late into the night. I'm talking to the council about that now.
Wow.
So
That's great. Now, Peggy, as I understand it, as part of this, the general thrust of it is, I think, to some extent, to take some of the positive energy that came from coming together in basically survival, and using it to sort of heal some of the divisions that were dogging the community in the last years, basically in terms of how much of a tourist town are we supposed to be, what kind of a tourist town, and that it could be spun forward in a positive way to address, maybe to bring that together in a useful way.
yeah, my interest is in human behavior, and it was disturbing to me that there were economic issues that were dividing the community around tourism, and we have been a tourist town. I would just like those tourists to be tourists that know that they're stepping into our habitat and helping us to build Ojai as the most resilient community, the smartest, sanest, sustainable community it can possibly be.
That's great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, a little history. We do history here. Now, during the fire week, I don't know how many of you were at on Saturday night, the local officials did a fire update over at the gym, Nordhoff Gym. I wasn't there, having spent the last 2 nights there on a cot. I thought, good enough. Thank you, Red Cross. But I watched it on YouTube later. And one of the guys who was there was Ventura Fire Captain Brendan Ripley, who is a fire behavior analyst. And what he said was, and he studied, not only did they study current topography, they studied the history of past fires in order to try to predict how the course this one was going to take as they were fighting it. And he said, among other things, something that struck me, he said, of the 20 largest fires in all of California's experience, going back to 1932 when they started keeping accurate records, 5 of them have surrounded the Ojai Valley at some point. Which to me, and this bears a little research, but it sounds to me like we are the most fire-threatened community in this state. I mean, 5 out of 20, and that did not even count pre-1932. And I'm here to tell you, as a person who remembers it well, let me just say, hi Pat, come on up. All right, one more panelist. Okay, everyone here obviously went through the Thomas Fire. How many here personally went through the Wheeler Fire in '85? Good half the room. We have a couple of people who, as children, remember the 48 fire. Thanks, Pat. And of course, we have no one who remembers the 1917 fire, so that's where I come in. Because that was the worst one. No, you didn't, Pat.
My grandfather.
Well, but yes, you'll be telling me about your grandfather. Exactly, in any moment. So the 1917 fire was the worst, not in terms of size, but in terms of what it almost did to the town. It started somewhere in the vicinity of Matilaha Canyon and Wheeler Hot Springs, and came over the ridge. Let me just, it killed 5 people, local, destroyed a whole bunch of structures, destroyed the Foothills Hotel, just ripped through what is now the Arbolada. Lots of fancy mansions designed by famous architects went up in smoke and ash. And it got so close to the brand new arcade and the brand new post office tower, because all of you remember last year we celebrated the centennial of what Libby wrought. Well, they finished that up in April, phase 1. And the fire started in June. And it came right down here. And you know how close it got? Where you're sitting. There was a Catholic church here, it burned, and as a result, Libby helped fund this lovely replacement, which is now the museum. This is as close as it got, but it got this close, and everything behind and above was burned to a cinder. Well, most of it. It always skips around for some reason.
The Foothills Hotel made it through, didn't it?
Not the first one, no, the first one burned. The second one made it through the 48 fire. It didn't survive development. Anyway, so since we are, I just was going to, the ranger in charge, and I suspect some of Pat's relatives were in there too, but the legendary ranger Jacinto Reyes was in charge, and he is quoted in history as saying of the 1917 fire, where did I write that down? With 200 men, we worked like demons for 5 days and 5 nights before we got the best of that blaze, but it was not until 30,000 acres was a blackened waste. In that fire, we had a terrific battle to save the buildings at the Wheeler Springs Resort. And while we were busy at that, the fire burned out of the forest and into the town of Ojai. And as you know, it went this far. Local historian Walter Bristol said of that fire, "The glow of the flames reflected by the smoke-filled air made the scene an inferno, never to be forgotten by those who witnessed it." Well, we all know exactly how he felt now. Anyway, to get to the historical part of the discussion, I have my panelists who are sitting up here. I'll bring them up one at a time, but I'll introduce you as I bring you up, actually. So let me bring Tony and Anne Fran Thatcher, and I'll hover over you.
Gonna need a ladder.
You want to stand? Okay.
Stay there.
Okay, and why don't you stand over here? I'll move the thing so you can kind of be.
Well, I'll do the same thing just to keep her company.
All right, there we go. Okay, so obviously Tony and Ann do not personally recall the 1917 fire, but you, I think, have some stories from family history, either in terms of Friends Ranch, Thatcher School, whatever. Ann, why don't you tell us what you might have written?
Well, I know 1917. My father was born in 1897, so he was 20 years old when that fire started. And he spoke of it, not regularly, but what I remember his saying is that he fought that fire. He went to Hickey Brothers, which is now Rain's store, and he bought 2 shovels, and that's what he fought the fire with. That was it. And what other factoids can I tell you about?
His name.
His name was George Elmer Friend. And there was another something I was going to say, but it was 100 years ago.
Was the ranch destroyed?
No, it wasn't destroyed. Where my family lived was on Grand Avenue, in the east end of Ojai. The property that we live on now, on Highway 33, wasn't purchased until 1962. So
not far
and
away.
But the Sheldons who homesteaded there they
Yeah.
also helped fight the fire. Needless to say, they were right in the thick of it.
Right.
yeah. But that fire started up on Highway 33, and it then swept toward the east end of the valley with devastating results. Sort of the opposite of our recent fire, which is kind of interesting. It sort of all depends on the wind,
To a great extent.
on how we all remember. Now, Tony and I were in San Francisco going to an opera.
In
Well,
the current fire,
And the current thing, which,
not in 17.
yeah, no. Well,
Is that Rienzi? Was it ends with a fire? No?
but no. There was something else I was going to say. I can't remember what it was. Oh, yeah, I guess I'll never have to see another one. depending on when the next one comes. It will come. There are 3 to 4 fires per century. And the 1948 fire was devastating, and it killed some people, didn't it?
At least one guy, according to the
Yeah.
history book.
And my friend, I don't know how many of you remember the Hughes family. They were major Ojai eccentrics. And Arthur and I went to school together at Monica Ross. And we're still in contact. Arthur told me once, he said, well, I finally got hold of my father's FBI file. And then he said, of course, mine is much longer.
We're getting off topic here.
I know, but I like that quote. Well,
As long as they laugh, we like it.
yeah, but,
What do you remember of the 1948 fire? Were you at Monica Ross?
no, it was in the summer, we were in Canada.
Oh,
She was 6.
well,
This
okay, but
is-
people remember.
Yeah.
I
My
remember.
Arthur sent me this photograph that his father, the one with the shorter FBI file, took. And that's about where
That's
Mike
like
Jaregi's
Thatcher.
house is.
Yeah, this is like the corner of Thatcher Road, where Ben's. Looks exactly the
It's
same,
same,
except
except
the orange
there's-
trees and the houses didn't burn there in this fire.
What else there was something else, but I've forgotten what it
Well, that's
was.
okay, you can interrupt Tony when you remember it.
Yeah.
Oh,
What do you got for
okay.
1917?
Yeah.
1917, my great-grandmother had built a Swiss chalet on the ridge on the east side of Foothill Road. And they would come out here from Milwaukee from time to time. And my mother, who was, she was 8, and my grandmother was there, and my uncle, who would have been 6. And they ran down Foothill Road in the middle of the night. No, not in the middle of the night, middle of the afternoon. And my mother said she could barely keep her feet on the ground. Her grandmother was running so fast with the fire on both sides of Foothill Road. And so she remembered it vividly and would tell us often to behave and no matches. And it, of course, burned up the Swiss chalet. But my great-grandmother immediately rebuilt it, and it fortunately is still there. It's that wooden house. It looks exactly like it came from, they called it Felsengarten.
Is that the one
That was pre-World War II, I'll have you
Is
know.
that the one that Anne Hathaway currently owns?
I think that she was,
We tried to get
it's
her
in
to
now.
win the panel, but
Yeah.
no luck.
So my mother always talked about that, and she said that the day after the fire, it was so hot in Ojai, it was still burning towards the east. But fortunately, the winds, I guess, that year, after, except for the sundowners that brought it down here, were not terrific. But she said her mother took her out there on the sidewalk, which, thanks to Mr. Libby, were there, and they fried an egg on the sidewalk. Which I don't think they ate, but it was a lesson in heat that my mother remembered. The 48 fire, I was 8 and living at Thatcher as a faculty brat. And it was in the summer. I remember that distinctly. And I was 8. It was a lark. You know, you're an 8-year-old. The adults are running around like crazy people. Which sort of gives you a certain independence that you don't always have, except maybe during the cocktail hour. And so we thought it was a high old time. My sister's 2 years older, and my brother was he would have been 3. So I guess we were tending to him. And they moved us down to, for the night in Sierra Robles because they were preoccupied doing what they needed to do, which we thought was fabulous. We camped out on Mimi Porter's lawn in sleeping bags. And I remember getting up at 5 in the morning and looking around and going in the house, not my own, and my parents were sacked out in the living room on couches, and there was great piles of memorabilia stacked there, as well as in our car. And the only thing I could think of was, I wonder if there's going to be breakfast. So that's sort of my memory of the 48 fire.
Let me jump in and say that 48 fire, some of you may not know, I just discovered this just a couple of years ago. Someone wrote a paper about it, which proved, for college, that the 48 fire is what gave rise to Charman. Because originally, now it came down and burned a house that apparently for years you could see the chimney up at North Signal. Mm-hmm. Now, kids today think it's Creek Road. Well, legends migrate. This is urban/rural legends. What's a more appropriate place for Charman? Creepy Creek Road at night. But it started.
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating to make a point, Pat. But it started the 48 fire. So anyway.
Yeah.
So
I remember my other thing, which before my father went to Hickey Brothers to buy the 2 shovels, he had been picking oranges on the Pierpont property, and the field boxes full of the oranges, it was so hot, the oranges turned black on top. And the other thing about that fire was that Tony's mother, I suppose she kept a bathtub full of water for the rest of her life.
Well, you never knew about Senior Canyon Water Company, for one thing. But, yeah, she always had the bathtub full of water, unless we had to take a bath.
what about the 85 fire?
85 fire, again, we chickened out. We were planned to take George and Emily on vacation, and so Alita Ann's sister said, well, go. And we did. And, it started right up by our house. But it was burning towards the east. And then the second night we were gone, and it jumped Matilaha to the other side and started burning towards Santa Barbara seriously again. And she said she was at the packing house that second night when it burned the ridge above the Lucking Ranch, or whatever you want to call it, Pete Rose Place. And she said, standing in the parking lot at the packing house on the other side of the river, it was so hot when that face went up, you had to hold your hand in front of your face. And of course, your eyeballs you were blinking as fast as you could. And you couldn't touch the packing house, it was so hot. Even though the fire was, I don't know how far that is, 300-400 yards, but generated a lot of heat.
That must be what did in the wheel. I just went and saw it, only left of it. But it's at the floor of a rock with nothing near it. The trees didn't burn. It somehow.
County Social Services will
Yeah, there may have
want
been a
it.
deliberate shove on that one. Anyway, and you were both out of town, of course. But let's bring it up to the present. How did you guys get through the recent unpleasantness?
Well, again, we had scheduled to do something else. So we had we left the day the fires. We left the day after the fire started in Santa Paula. And then, of course, it already just done an unbelievable amount of damage to the southscape of Ventura. South-facing scape.
Now is the mudslides. If you drive up 33, you will see many huge rocks perched precarious.
Well, that's I've warned anybody that wanted to listen to me that this thing is not over yet. I'm totally conflicted as a farmer, and that I need water. but I don't want it to flood. The back of our house is already plywooded. It flooded in '69 and in '75. But we live in the mountains, and the only way you get mountains is by erosion. So you want to live in the mountains, you're going to have uplift, that's earthquakes. You're going to have fires, and then you're going to have erosion. So you should be thinking about that and planning about it. And if you have something that's quite close to something that might come down, you're going to need more than sandbags. So, especially if we have patio doors, that kind of thing. They're all boarded up. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom, but I want it to rain. I'm sorry.
Gloom is okay. And Nadia's going to talk a little about water as well, because she's already had an experience with that. All right, well, Tony.
Thank you.
Okay, let's bring Patricia Clark Dorner up. She can get in that chair. Yeah, let's see if we can get you
Situated?
Say hi, Pat.
I'm a
How's that
little
working
bit
out?
stiffer than I used to be. Oh, look at so many people I know. How nice.
So, Pat, I think, is a former board member here, among other things, as is her late husband was our longtime treasurer, so longtime family association here. And of course, a very distinguished historian, local and larger than local, including her family, and the author of a book about her cousin Bill, who was a very important man in California and national politics, Bill Clark, Judge Clark. And Pat, therefore, has some history to talk about regarding great Uncle Tom and your grandfather Bob and past fires and also recent fires. Anyway, we'll talk about that. So let's start with the history. What was the Clark family and the fire of 17?
Well, according to Ida Stork, the Clarks were the fourth American family to settle in the Ojai. I didn't check this out, but...
We trust you on that.
Pat,
What?
put the microphone
Hold the mic closer.
to her.
Oh,
We don't want to miss it.
Yeah.
Good.
anyway, that better?
Is that okay?
In 1917, for example, almost all the family was involved in stifling the flames from the fire that threatened the backcountry and the town itself. Great Aunt Peg, she was quite a horsewoman, and she led in pack trains with supplies for the firefighters. My grandfather, Bob Clark, so damaged his vocal cords that he spoke little above a whisper for the rest of his life. One tale that survives from this time, he was lying on the ground unconscious. A little boy woke him up and led him to safety. He had no idea who the little boy was, but the family concluded it was a preview of his last-born son, Chad. We are Irish, you know. Bob was elected Ventura County Sheriff by an overwhelming margin in 1922. Then he was appointed U.S. Marshal. After his retirement in 1949, he and his wife Alice would gather the family for the traditional barbecue, after which the grandchildren would gather at his feet to hear his stories, except for me. I was somewhat hard of hearing and very shy, and I didn't want to not be able to respond to a statement that he made, because I couldn't hear well enough. After his death, I went to all of his children to gather his stories. And from the stories upon stories, and after following clue after clue, I ended up with 14 four-drawer file cabinets filled with those priceless stories. But I was certainly more aware than most of the fire danger in our part of the world. When we built our home on Rancho del Cielo, we included a fire hydrant and a hose, dug a never-failing well, which fed into our 36,000 steel water tank located above the house, so that it would gravity feed down to our 5,500 square foot house.
When did you build the house, Beth? What year? Approximately.
It's not, see, it was before, I don't know. It wasn't that long ago.
Early.
But I built it once, and the guy papered the windows backwards, so we had to take all the stucco off and put put it back on again.
Was it
And,
before the 85 fire that you built?
yeah, yeah, so 85, 95, I think so. I don't do numbers. Anyway. Oh yeah, we have a wonderful well, which fed into our 36,000 still water tank located above the house so that it would gravity feed down to our 5,500 square foot house, holding many family treasures and those 14 file cabinets. But it wasn't enough to slow Thomas down. Some person, I believe from search and rescue, banged on the door and yelled mandatory evacuation. I said, but I've got a perfectly good fire hydrant and hose just across the driveway. I was under the impression they were going to save the house, but they just wanted me out of the way. Under protest, I and my border collie, Coda, drove to my son John's in Ventura. He tells me I couldn't have withstood the power of the fire hose, that I wouldn't be strong enough, also the wind. And Brother Jim, even with the help of 2 or 3 other guys, lost his main house as well. The house that burned to the ground shortly after my father's death in December of 1970. So what's next? I have some pictures if you'd like to see them.
Yes, we could pass them around.
Okay, yeah. Pictures of the house and the rooms, and then finally the devastation. It was quite a shock. I went up the next day and I don't know what I expected, but there were just 2 fireplaces. That's that picture. So.
But you tell me you're planning to rebuild.
Not personally.
Oh, no? Oh, not personally.
No. There's another one. But my son and I are thinking about getting a couple of refabs. But prefabs. I wouldn't dream of building up there by myself at this point. You've got to be really strong to withstand this stuff. And I thought that a fire hydrant and hose would be enough.
Did you lose all of your writing?
Everything. Yeah, all my research, 14 file cabinets full. So I've got to write fiction now.
Thank you, Pat. Next up, Alistair Coyne, landscape gardener, rescuer of the wild sesame. And Alistair, you live in the Upper Valley, or my Upper Valley. We have
yeah.
Pat, of course, is Sulphur Mountain, and Tony and Ann are up towards Matilaha Canyon, and Nadia's in Matilaha Canyon. And I needed to get an Upper Valley guy, and you're it. So
Well, I was here in the 85 fire, but at that point I was in Miners Oaks on Miners Road, and I just finished building a house with my first wife there, and the fire didn't come close, but it was pretty crazy for about a week, and that fire also burned, everything from the edge of town up to the ridge, except it was moving towards Topa Topa rather than the other way. And an interesting thing I remember from that fire, being a gardener and looking around afterwards, is that orange trees don't burn, which is kind of counterintuitive because you think of oranges as being oily, the leaves. And if they're next to the fire, the trees at the edge of the orchard, they'll lose all their leaves, but fire doesn't travel through them, whereas it does on avocados, which you wouldn't think of as being flammable. So you're safer with oranges right around your house than with avocados. So as to the current fire, I live on Caesar Road. The fire came by my property about 9:30 that night. I could talk about
would
where
this be Monday night?
Monday
The first
night, yeah. Do people know how and where it started? I mean, there were 2 starts, about an hour apart. You guys have heard that? The first,
Königstein Road, right?
the first start was about 5:30 or so, and it was somewhere to the north of Steckel Park, kind of near the KOA, maybe behind that. I've heard that. I don't know anything more specific than that, and that's not really known how that started. And sometimes it's years after fires start that the Forest Service or the fire department tell you how they think it started. So don't expect to hear anything very soon. And then, for some reason, there was another fire started at the very end of Königstein Road, right by the last house at the top of the road there. And I talked to the family that lived there that I know, and they heard some crackling and looked out of the window and saw sparks flying from a transformer at the top of the pole and landing on the ground and starting to catch fire. And of course, they left right away. And from what I've heard is that was a transformer that was an older model that was known to be faulty. And the Edison company had changed a lot of other transformers of that kind in that area recently, but they hadn't changed that one. I think they probably will regret that. And a few days later, another friend of mine drove up past that spot, and she described that there were scores of Edison company investigators, scores. And they had it cordoned off, they were taking things down off the poles, wrapping them up in bubble wrap or whatever, and putting them on the trucks to take them away. And so they're very aware of their responsibility for starting that. I'm still confused as to, where and when those two fire starts met. The one that came towards me on Caesar Road was, I imagine, from Königstein, because the wind was blowing directly from Königstein towards me. But as that was happening, I could see on the other side of my house, looking out towards Sulphur Mountain, that was a flame. And the flames on, to the north of me and the south were both about the same level. The front of each fire was about the same and moving in about the same speed. Of course, on Sulphur Mountain, it was burning mostly the oak leaves underneath the trees, because oak trees don't really catch fire very much. But the wind was carrying them very, very quickly. I got up on my roof at one point. I'd left a ladder up there because I wanted to be able to get up and see what was happening. That was the highest point I could get to on my property. And I went up there about 9 with my little camera on video and did a panorama and was saying what I saw. And when I played that, a couple of days later, I couldn't even hear what I was saying because the wind was just going whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And the camera just picked up the sound of the wind, not my voice. Anyway, I was very fortunate not to suffer any damage on my property, but 5 houses out of 40 on Caesar Road went. And I've had some interesting thoughts about the fire and the language that's used by the authorities in fire, because they tell you to get out of your house, and there's no time to get into lengthy discussions with people because the people that are having to get you out have to keep moving, tell other people. But they don't tell you that there's probably not going to be a fire truck by your house saving it. And in many cases there wasn't, particularly in the first few nights before there was more organization. Of course, at that point, in the Upper Valley, the road between Santa Paula and Ojai was closed because there were power poles down. So, vehicles couldn't get to the Upper Valley that way. And if they were coming up through Ventura into Ojai. And at the end of one of the roads near me, there was a good friend of mine that lost his house. And there was a fire truck sitting in the driveway with 3 guys in the front of the fire truck with the windows rolled up watching. You go figure. So what they say, and that's their rules, and first responders have rules and regulations for their safety, and but it's kind of crazy because there was a hydrant there and people skilled at putting out fires and a fire there with no one doing anything. But the rules are that they weren't allowed to tackle a blaze unless they had 2 fire trucks. So go figure, why were fire trucks sitting there without 2 of them there? I know, anyway. There were fire vehicles going up and down Caesar Road all that night. You can't sleep after that happens. I was awake, and at about 10 o'clock the fire was past me. I could see it was moving to the west, and at that point there weren't any sparks coming towards me anymore. And so I walked up and down the road, 11 and 1 and 3 and 5 and 7, just taking pictures and looking at what was going on. And, someone's house went up at 7 in the morning because there was some spark must have been there in the bushes beside the house, gradually building up since 9 o'clock the night before and just taken out the house, between 6 and 7, so. And there were many trucks going up and down the road that night, fire vehicles with, SUV-type vehicles, and there were a couple of fire trucks there. And they did save some houses on Caesar Road, but it's infuriating what they weren't able to do. After a few days, there were many more fire vehicles and people in town, and by the time it came down to like the Fairview area, I've heard that there were fire trucks at every few houses, and they were certainly equipped. But on that first night, they just didn't have that much stuff together because it takes time to move vehicles around.
And they were in Ventura rather heavily.
And they were probably.
Alice, I don't think you made it clear. You were fighting the fire though with a hose.
I've thought about fires forever, and I knew exactly what I would do if there was a fire. And I was able to get home and do that. I was actually in Santa Barbara that night at 7:30 driving back, and someone called me, and they didn't know I wasn't home. And they said, well, get home and don't come through Santa Paula, because if I'd come through Santa Paula, the road would have been closed, and I'd have had to go back to Ventura, and that would have taken another hour. So I have roof vents on the top of my house. I have a very small house. It's 1,000 square feet, just a rectangle with a ridge roof. On the top of the roof ridge, there's vents that allow air to escape out of above the joists and the insulation. And so I've always had a big roll of fresh duct tape, so I went up there and duct taped that vent on both sides because there was enough space for a spark to get in. That's why I put the ladder on the roof originally. And then I had hoses, and I stretched them out at various points on the property with jet nozzles on the end, turned off, but with the tap turned on, so I could just pick up a hose anywhere and put something out, which actually I didn't need to do on my place. I never had smoke that made me feel I had to leave or go inside. My house is concrete walled. It's got panels that are made of concrete on the walls and under the eaves, so there's nothing really to catch on my house. My house I felt was safe, but my Quonset hut was wooden walled, and I wanted to protect that. There was one little spark landed across my neighbor's fence in the grass under the trees, and I was able to reach it with my hose nozzle. It was about as far as halfway back through this room. And it just started, and it was like 3 feet across, and I got that out in a minute or so. But if I hadn't been there, if I'd left, that would have grown from 2 feet to, and the wind was coming towards me, it would have taken out the Quonset hut. So in terms of what I mentioned earlier about the language that the responders use, they tell you have to get out, but they don't tell you what that means. But then again, someone in that situation can't necessarily just decide to stay and save their house. You have to you really have to know about this beforehand and know what you're going to do and have the equipment. And I've talked to many, many people in the Upper Valley and elsewhere that saved their houses, that quietly stayed. No one necessarily wrote about them in the newspapers, but they saved their houses, and sometimes they saved neighbors' houses. But it really is important to be prepared and to think about what you might have to do in the future and to have the stuff there and know what you would do. Because you can't really make that decision on the spur of the moment. I mean, I've got friends in the Upper Valley that lost their houses, that, the gentleman was in his 80s and his arm was in a sling because he'd broken it, and, he wasn't going to go out there with a hose and save his house, so he left and their house is gone. But if you're younger and fitter and you know that you can be prepared and take some action and know what the risks are, know at what point you'll have to leave if the conditions get too bad, you do have a chance of saving your house. So.
What do you do if they say this is a mandated evacuation?
Well, apparently, that's the words they use. And apparently, as I've talked to people later, there is actually no way they can make you leave your property. Legally, the cops. I mean, I think they know that. If you question them on that and you say, you can't, and then they'll back down. But in the course of what they have to do that night, that's the word they use, and so you trust them because they're, the cops, right? So it's interesting just thinking about the language that's used at the beginning of an emergency and how we respond to it and what we don't know.
Well, we know more now.
We know more now.
And we'll know more in the months to come. We're learning quite a bit. Anyway, thank you, Alex.
That's probably all I really have to say.
Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Everyone's got a story, of course, everyone in the room. Just today, earlier today, I ran into Fred Whitman. A lot of you probably know Fred, the sculptor. His mother's Nancy Whitman, the artist. And Fred's story, they live up Königstein, probably not far from where the fire started. And he and his brother Charlie were on the roof with hoses until the soles of their shoes were melting. And they saved Nancy's house, a studio, but Fred lost his studio. So, anyway. So I'd like to bring up Nadia Natali. Nadia lives up, and her husband Enrico live in Blue Heron Ranch, I believe it is. Matilaha Canyon. And Nadia is the author of a book that we don't have, but we're going to get it here because I'm, by golly, going to read it because it's called Growing Up Gershwin, as I just learned today. And Nadia is, in fact, the niece of George and Ira, which is, how great is that? Anyway, so we will have that book next time you come in stock.
Well,
Anyway.
it may be here. I didn't expect this at part of the announcement, so I feel a little bit shy about that. But thank you anyway.
Well, I can't possibly not say.
Well, apparently
You are the
not.
niece of George and I. You're lucky I will not start singing. There's a somebody who... No. Anyway, we were going to do a PowerPoint, but our systems don't mesh, but
Yeah.
Nadia's got...
I've got some pictures, and you might be able to see them from a distance.
Can I hold them, or while
Yeah.
you talk? Or,
Yeah, but what you have to do is just go like this, you know,
Okay.
and then,
Yeah.
but
And you guys can come look at it afterwards for more detail.
So actually, this book that he mentioned, and I didn't expect to have it announced, starts out with my husband and I moving to Matilaha Canyon in 1980. That's going to be tiring, so if you just...
Tell me when to raise it.
Well, yeah, when we get to the fire part. And we bought property in Matilaha Canyon. If you know Matilaha Canyon, it's a 5-mile windy road in, and then there's a very big metal gate. And we bought property in the National Forest, off the grid, no electricity. Can you guys hear me back there?
Yes.
Way back? Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Somebody said up. And we were met by a Forest Service person who told us to get a lock for the gate. And he said, "Do you guys know what you're doing?" And we had a little fold-out trailer, and they said, you know, there are rattlesnakes, bears, mountain lions, and the rivers, we have 2 rivers to cross. They flood when it rains, and you guys are going to get stuck in there. But we are very concerned about fire. It hasn't burned in 50 years. And so Enrico and I mean, this was our first day we were arrived. I mean, what a welcoming. Like, thanks a lot. And we had a 3-year-old daughter with us, and we moved onto the, well, almost moved onto the property. It was so thick with chaparral. And the first thing we realized is we had to worry about fire. And we very slowly took years to build a workshop and a house. It took about 4 years. We lived in a teepee for most of that time, and had more children. But one of the first things we did was build a reservoir with 30,000 gallons of water. And we had fire pumps, and we had water coming down from the river. We did have quite a bit of water at that time, as most of us did. And so we had ways of putting in systems, and so we were prepared. And 1985, July, I think it was 9th? I mean, 1985, what?
July 1st, I think the Wheeler fire started.
Was it July 1st? I knew it was around July 4th. We saw flames at Wheeler's. From our property, we saw flames up there. And I think it was that night we went to bed, and I think it was a sheriff came and said we had to evacuate. And we evacuated that time we had 3 children, and came into Ojai and stayed at someone's house. And Enrico went back the next morning to turn off the propane tanks, because if he hadn't, it would explode. And when he went in, he found 2 young guys there, and they said, "We came to help you save your place." At that time, we had a main house and a workshop. And these guys pulled out all the fire hoses. As Alistair said, you need to be ready, and we were. I took the children, I had to go pick up Enrico's son from a former marriage at LAX, and so I was driving that way while he was going in, And I had no idea whether he was alive or what had happened. And I remember driving back, and at the bottom of Matilaha Canyon, there was a sheriff there. The road was blocked, and I said, I have to go in and see if my husband's alive. And he hemmed and hawed and looked at the kids behind the seat, the back seat, and he said, it's at your own risk. And I remember driving in through that canyon, and there was just fire on both sides of the road, all the way in. It was just, I don't know how I made it, but when I got home, I found Enrico, my husband, where he's here somewhere, and, and these two guys, and the story that he has to tell is in the book, which was quite interesting because they had to backfire in order to save the place, and they did with hoses around the main house, not workshop. They just wet it down, and it just, the smoke came through. They couldn't see where the house was practically. It was they just had to wait for hours. I'm actually shortening the story quite a bit. So this was actually quite a lesson, and we have been prepared again for fires. I don't know if you have any questions about that part of it, but when in the last few years we knew another one was due, and I'm sorry. Oh, I thought you said something.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, we knew something was due, and we were just holding our breath, and we've actually put in 2 10,000-gallon tanks of water in addition to our reservoir of water. And this time, when we heard the fire was coming, I left. I left out of fear. I wanted to disappear. The children were all grown and gone. And then that night, I was at a friend's. That night, I realized I'd made a mistake, and I turned around the next morning and went back home. And Enrico and I and Javier, who is someone who works at our place, the three of us got ready. And this time, I got to hold the fire hose, and I have to tell you, it's heavy, it's long and heavy, and it drips. And you're holding this hose and trying to put out fire. But I want to tell you something else. When in 85, some fire people came in, some firefighters came in, they looked around the place, they saw what we had, and they turned around and left. And so it was just Enrico and these two guys that were able to take care of the fire, the whole place. This time, it was 3 of us, and we started preparing, and lo and behold, the night of the fire, which was December 9th for us, the wind hadn't blown at all. It was blowing like crazy all over Ojai. For some reason in the canyon it didn't. And I remember the night, or maybe it was the night before, and I said to Enrico, I'm going to drive down the canyon and see if anything is happening. And he wouldn't come with me. He and Javier, I said, will you come with me? It was nighttime, and they said, no, we're busy, whatever. So I'm going to go myself. So I drove down the canyon, and I saw the fire had come into the big reservoir over the hill, and it was starting to go down towards along the river. So I drove back, and I told Enrico, and I said, I want you to see this. So he came with me, and we looked at it, we realized this is it. So we really got ready that night, and then the fire people started coming in, firefighters. Unlike the first time, we had 75 firefighters at our property. 75. And we were walking around and helping and telling them where things were, and they said, this place is great. We are so happy to help you here because we can. You've really prepared well. So this is something I'm repeating that Alistair said a moment ago. If you're ready and prepared, you can stay and fight the fire. We could have done it without these guys. We wouldn't have saved most of the stuff, but we would have saved the main house. And again, the workshop, which were the most important buildings. They stayed. So this is where I just want to show a couple of things. Let me do it.
Here, yeah. Bring it back.
So this is when I was driving down Matilaha Canyon. I don't know how many of you can see it, but I saw the fire had come in. Higher. Yeah, you can look, if you want to look at it afterwards. And well, I wanted to, oh dear. So this is when it was coming in. They said, oh, I have to tell you another thing. I was really hoping they would backburn. So that was my conversation with a lot of these guys. I said, would you consider backburning? And they said, yes, we have decided we're going to. We have to wait until the fire comes up over the ridge. And once it does, we'll start backburning. And I said, I hope on all sides. They said, yes, because this would give us a chance to not have a fire come years to come in the future. And they waited, and the fire came down too soon. It actually dropped and started burning, and this is when it dropped, and it started burning right on our property, and they started to backburn up the side of the mountain, and this is what that looked like. So I got out my iPhone and started photographing. And I have to tell you, I felt very guilty because here everyone is trying to fight the fire and I'm just doing some really silly thing. But all the firefighters that were around me took out their iPhones or their cameras and were taking pictures too. Yeah, so I went, whew, okay. So this was right, we were right there. So it was pretty intense going up the mountainside. Yeah. And this is a sort of a Christmassy picture. Yeah. And then just as it ends, and then a lot of hot spots. And so for days we had fire all around. We didn't know if it, I mean, we knew it wouldn't come back, and the firefighters kept, that's probably as much as I'm going to show you. And then this is the road driving out. Just gone. Everything is, eaten up, burnt up.
Is that the yellow brick road?
Yes, actually, that's what I said. The yellow burnt road. About 4 weeks later, the floods came, and we had built, again, prepared. We have so many rocks on our property that we built berms, and they are actually, if you know what they are, if you don't, I'll tell you, they're like big stone walls, piles of stones that are very high and go very long, so 100 yards. And we built 9 of them because the river comes right behind our house, and then it makes a turn and goes up against the rock mountainside and hits that and continues down the canyon. But if something were to happen, like it did with this fire, and there was a lot of rocks falling down and debris and mud, it could easily be diverted. And so these berms were sort of like a hand, where you had one here and then one there and one there and one there. And these were far apart. But if one didn't work, the next one would be there. And so the last berm, which was right behind our barn, filled up completely with debris and mudslide and trees and huge redwoods. You wouldn't believe, well, let me see if you can, this may be hard to see from far away, but that's what, whoops.
No. Now, you guys got about 5 inches up there, right? We only got 2.5 or so down here, but you got a lot more up in the canyon. didn't
5
you?
inches.
Of rain.
We got, Enrico, what did we get? How many inches of rain? 14?
7 inches
In a few hours, yeah.
Okay, that's more than 5.
50 square miles range.
I lost it because I have these duplicated. I don't know if I can find it now. But these redwoods that just came down all over the place. Sorry.
That's all right.
And it flooded and took away our barn and our arena.
So the water was worse than the fire, is it?
For
your
our property, the flood did worse damage than the
And as
property.
Tony points out, it's not like it's over.
No, and what's interesting is their desire to backburn, which was just what I wanted and just what they wanted, and they said, we're lucky we both agree on this. I wonder whether they're going to reconsider that, because I'm sure they did a lot more back burning than they had to, and it created probably more flooding than it would have. So I don't know.
Well, thank you, Nadia.
Yeah, so any questions, or do I not do that?
Well, if anybody has any questions for any of the panels, we'll be happy to take them. Also, we have a little more time. If everyone here has a story. Sir?
Yeah, I live on the other end of the canyon from Nadia, and we have a success story.
Oh, good.
To share it with you.
You bet. What's your name, sir?
Dan Lang,
Hi, Dan. Come on up.
come on down. We went through the 85 fire, and this fire was considerably different, but I think a lot of it had to do with the wind. But we were fairly well prepared for the 85 fire, but this fire we were well prepared. In 85, we live at where the canyon is. It's like an hourglass, and it gets real tight. We are right in the tight spot. And the house was built in 1938. We've been there 38 years. We've seen numerous floods and 2 fires. The 85 fire, we were in Mexico with my parents, and we just had a funny feeling about the weather. So we came back to San Diego on our way home, and Carol Palmer, our neighbor, was on TV. We hustled buns with our car as fast as we could to get back here. We fought the fire with my cousin for 30 hours. It was a different kind of fire. When we got there, the mouth of the canyon was burning with a down canyon breeze, so it was chattering very slow up the canyon. It took 5 hours for the fire to reach from where houses in this fire burned completely to reach our house. We had the ability to pump 135 gallons a minute, which is about like a fire hose, and we proceeded to do that. The power lines went out pretty quickly. We switched to a gas engine. We ran out of gas, put paint thinner in it, clogged the carburetor with pieces of paint, ended up with a squirt can and a human carburetor, me and my cousin, and we fought the fire. We gave away 8,000 gallons of water to fire trucks. 10 minutes before the fire, they abandoned the fire and said we had to leave too. We stayed because we were still pumping 135 gallons a minute, and at the last moment, one single fire truck came in with a PTO pump, and we squirted water into him, and we used his equipment to fight the fire basically around the house, because it came from Nadia's all the way down and up and met at that little inverted place where we live, and burned completely around us. Burned our fruit off the fruit trees, burned around our propane tanks. We were there, we really saved it, because small things would start burning in trees, and when we were there to put them out after the fire person had already left. So we had to stand by for 30 hours. It was an exciting fire. It took us weeks to get over it. We told the story and a lot longer than I'm telling this one. And it was a time for winding down, and something that we will never forget. The fire this time was entirely different. We have grandkids there. My son lives there too. The women in the family said, you can stay, but you can only stay until you feel like there's no place to go, and then you better leave. And so we promised to leave, told them to leave long before we did. And we watched the fire, basically smoke coming, and now with the internet and everything else, you're pretty aware, as long as you have electricity and some outward communications of what's happening. We knew the fire was on the east end of Ojai, and it was going to take a little while to get across there. Well, it took an hour and a half to burn behind Ojai. Came much faster than we imagined. The women were already out, and we'd promised them that we would leave. The rule of thumb in a fire is keep one foot in the black and 1 foot, or 2 feet in the black if you can be, but 1 foot in the black and 1 foot in the part that hasn't been burned. And so that was our promise, that if we couldn't be in the black, we wouldn't feel safe. Even though the fire department has built a pretty good size, what they consider a fire-safe area for their equipment in our canyon, and we knew Nadia's place, had some open space. We didn't feel like we wanted to go where things could burn and stay there, so we didn't. We saw the fire in the evening coming up Nordoff Ridge. It was dark, and we said, it's time for us to go. Fortunately, years ago, I purchased this stuff here, which is Barricade, and it's a fire gel. And I really don't, I knew a bit. I'm a science teacher, so I worked with this in my science classes for years, treating everything in the chaparral, building materials and everything, and setting it on a 2-burner stove and timing it with my kids, watching full-on flames below it and watching wind smoke appeared on either treated and untreated, and when it burned, when it was ash, and it was decidedly a piece of fire equipment that I could believe in. So I purchased probably originally 5 gallons of it. This time I had 15 gallons on hand, and I felt like it was going to be my insurance policy, especially if my wife and my family had insisted that I leave, because I think that had we not been there in '85, we'd have lost our house. And heartbreaking as that is for Pat, what it's like, and the people in our canyon and in Berry Flats that lost houses this time, it's devastating. And my prayers go out to all of you who have suffered that kind of thing, because we were prepared leaving to have the same experience. At any rate, it was nighttime. The fire was coming towards the mouth of the canyon. We felt like we had no safe place to be. So we cut our electricity because we knew the fire would probably kill the power. We turned on our generator, which is, and this is where I get into the prep readiness that Alistair's talking about. We started our 7K generator, which is not a super expensive generator, but we trust it. I believe it's even a Chinese takeoff of a Honda, which would be the really good one to have. And we cut the electricity off, started our generator, turned on sprinkler systems on our roof, which are permanently there. It looks like a lawn up there, basically. My house is a redwood covering. My son's barn is covered with hardy boards, so it's a lot more fire resistant. My roof is a Class A fire retardant roof, but it's not tin. And so I let the sprinklers go and took the Barricade, which is fairly old. As a matter of fact, talking to the manufacturer, he said that I probably used the oldest Barricade successfully that's ever been used. It's probably about 15 years old. And in the middle of the fire, we still had communications. I told him that basically, not the middle of the fire, but the middle of our preparation, I called him on the phone and said, I'm having a hard time spraying this stuff out. It covers great, and then it starts clogging. He says, well, you're a science teacher, and he knew me from before when I did experiments, and he said, believe it or not, thin it with kerosene or diesel. And I said, I have diesel. And I said, I'll thin it. And so I started thinning it, and anyway, we covered everything. I brought my computer, and you'll see we sprayed metal buildings, we sprayed tires, we sprayed cars we were working on, we sprayed, it was fall this time. Leaves are falling out of the trees. What are you going to do, It's not like July when the other fire was there and fire clearance happens in June. This is where fire clearance happened a long time ago, and the trees are losing leaves. This very day, I sprayed leaves with it. I sprayed every possible thing.
Did you turn off the sprinklers on the roof and spray the roof?
I didn't spray the roof because we had sprinklers up there. I went up there and sprayed any windows that were up on part of the roof, but I sprayed all the windows in every house. Sprayed things that you knew wouldn't burn, but you didn't want heat to happen. The story behind this stuff is this man, Jim, I can't remember his last name right now, but he was a fireman, and he was inspecting a house that burned in Florida. And the house was charcoal. and he came across a baby diaper, and the diaper was not burned. Whether it had pee in it or water, I don't know what, but it had performed the duty of a diaper. It had absorbed water, and the whole house, metal was burnt, everything was melted, and this diaper was sitting there. It was black on the outside, but he opened it up, and it's perfectly white. He said, how did this happen? And he discovered that there's a polymer inside a baby diaper. You can do it yourself. I did it with my kids for years. You take a baby diaper, one that hasn't been used, and which you've all dissected, I'm sure, used ones, but it's nice to do one that's brand new. Shake out the little chemicals. They'll look like salt at the bottom of a glass. Just a very few chemicals. Fill the jar with the glass with water, and it'll gel right to the top, and then it looks just like gelatin, And what it is it surrounds the molecules or the atoms of water, molecules of water with this polymer, and it does it molecule by molecule. So you end up with a barrier of water that has to evaporate in each layer, and it's good for 30 hours. Well, when we left the fire this time, believe me, we thought we could chase the fire in. We're going to come in behind the fire as soon as we could. We got out and we were stuck at the quarry for 7 hours the next day. We couldn't get in for 24 hours. And I was counting the hours going, is my barricade still got time? It's good, 30 hours is the end of it. And well, at 4:30 in the morning, 24 hours later, we came in by motorcycle and walking, jumped over the flaming power poles and got in after you had gone through your whole experience and walked by 4 completely destroyed houses, and then one where our good friends had saved a couple of houses with a fire hose, and we still didn't know what our house was like. My son went in a little faster on a motorcycle with his fire friends, and I kept walking, and pretty soon he was coming back, and he says, "Dad, you can't believe it. Every bit of the garden is fine. It looks like nothing happened at our whole house, And we're ecstatic, We went back in, and not only had we saved our house, but the fire had split within 2 feet of my shop, where I had sent 2 nozzles out while the generator was operating, which it quit probably 6 hours before the fire got to us. It had run out of fuel. All I had done is sprayed out a lot of water, which in my opinion is pretty much wasted really, because it all evaporates as the fire's coming. But it had gelled in this gel that I had sprayed around, and what was still on the house was still there. And the fire actually split, Nadia will tell you, the 50 houses. It went around 50 houses in our community, And my daughter was in San Francisco trying to keep up with the fire, and she sent me a satellite image of the fire, wrapped around our house, and it couldn't join on the back side. It couldn't join. If it had joined, it would burn that circle out, including our house, had the barricade not been there. And it couldn't join, and it just took off and went up the top of the mountains. By the time the fire reached our 50 houses, the county had already cleared the road. Fire trucks were at every house, and it just chattered in like the old 85 fire, nice and slow, and nobody was panicky, and everybody was thrilled, I can't say that this saved our house, but it saved I would not have left if I had not used it. There was not a spot within 20 feet of my shop. It's incinerated as it went up the hill. I know that sparks were flying all over the place. Not a spot on my property had a small burn at all.
And you thinned it with diesel.
You thin it with diesel.
So you literally put out the fire with gasoline.
and water, I have, some of it has to be theory, because I had to think about it. The back of my shop took 40,000 gallons of water in 4 hours, but I had sprayed it with Barricade. There was a camper shell full of tires right there. I knew they were there when I sprayed it. There were leaves there. I sprayed those. The water running down on this Barricade should have washed it off everything, but it still settled in all the ground areas where all those sparks had to be because there was fire 5 feet away, you know, and it didn't burn, not a tire, not a nothing. And so preparedness, you know, I have 11 hydrants. We never even used them. There was nobody there when the fire reached my house, except for just what I had set up, you know. And I would never tell somebody that lives in a tract home or in a subdivision, you know, count on 40,000 gallons of water, you know, because you have a hydrant right there. You know, if no one's there to use it, if you use it for 5 hours before the fire gets there, it's going to evaporate anyway. It all has to happen in the 10 or 15 minutes of the time that the fire is trying to burn through your property and the time that you can be there later to make sure nothing starts again, you know? So, question, Pat?
Do you think if I had refused to leave, I mean, somebody tells me to do something, I do it, you know, but if I had refused to leave, do you think I mean, I had the fire hydrant, I had plenty of water, do you think I could have saved my house?
You know, you had a stucco house, you know? I've been at your house. Every window is an opening to a fire, basically, you know?
It was the wood over the stucco.
Yeah, and you know, if you had had a chemical you'd throw on it, I'd say, basically, you could have walked away from it, you know, spraying your windows, spraying your eaves, like you did, you covered your vents with duct tape. Anything to keep a spark from getting inside your house where things are highly flammable is super important, you know. The water factor is not the biggest factor, you know. It has to be there because you might have to put out some stuff, and the fire department can depend upon the water. You know, even though they took 8,000 gallons of my water in '85 and abandoned the fire, if they hadn't been called to abandon that fire, they would have used it. They later carried it back in and used it to help, you know, spot fires in '85 in our community. But they did take it with them at the moment of crisis, you know. And I told them, well, you left me with an empty tank almost, but we're still here and we're pumping. And, you know, at that point, you know, my wife hadn't asked me to leave. I guess I was more valuable the second time around.
So now you can take 30 years off.
She's saying cut off, Dan, that's enough. But anyway.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, thank you. That's a terrific story, and I'm making a note of barricade.
Yeah, well, they're going to be pushing it a little bit more because of the testimony of people. Some insurance companies are coming in and doing this themselves, you know, because it saves with other chemicals too, not just barricade. But it's, I think it's part of the preparation that gave me a good feeling of leaving my house, you know, which I couldn't get just by having water spraying and a generator that's going to run out of water. So.
Well, thank you. That's a terrific story. Thank you for contributing. So we're running near the end. Is anyone ready? Ray Powers, who lived at Batilaha Hot Springs, where Ojai began. So let's hear from Ray.
Hello.
Ray's also on the Planning Commission currently. Just thought I'd throw that in.
Thanks.
And of course, a distinguished composer. Take it away.
Listening to Nadia and Dan, I'm going to confess my naivety of not knowing fire. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, so I know earthquakes pretty well. There were lots of earthquake drills. There were never any fire drills. You know, I live at the mouth of the canyon, but it's a box canyon because there's a dam there now. So it's the original Batilaha Hot Springs. I was there 11 years. About 8 years ago, the Ventura County Watershed Protection District bought it as part of the dam removal project. And they gave it a modicum of attention. I was there sort of as a caretaker, but mostly for security to keep people out, because they were worried about liability and people getting hurt there. But I didn't think much about fire. They came every year to do weed abatement, but I noticed as the years went by, they did less and less. And I would mention it, but it was kind of budgetary considerations they had, I think. Because they started with work crews of like 8, and then this year there were like 4. And I also noticed that they didn't cut down dead pine trees. There were a couple downed oaks they didn't remove. And I mentioned it, and they took notes, and I wasn't proactive about, taking them out myself, or bringing people in to help me take it out and really clean up the area. If you know that, I mean, a lot of people here used to swim there when it was open to the public, because it got auctioned off in 1988. So prior to that, it was open to the public. And so there's buildings there. The post office is a stone post office that was built in the 1870s. There was a cottage from the 1930s, 1940s, 1970s, a couple from the 1990s. So there are all different kinds of constructions happening. Most of them pretty brittle. So what's remaining there is 3 walls of the post office. The fire came in, came up the highway, burned through Camino Cielo and Ojala. Anna lost, and her sons lost all those buildings, but one cabin, I believe. So it came up there and over, and then it came down, it jumped the highway where the rock quarry is on 33, and then went up over that hill. Now the interesting thing is that I lost a water main and it blew. I came out maybe 4 months ago, and there's water coming out of the asphalt road. And Casitas comes and they replaced the water main, and they changed out the fire hydrant from a 4-inch to a 6-inch. So I had a brand new hydrant, but there was no hose there. I didn't think to ask, well, will you leave a hose here and a wrench to open the thing? Because it's gated off, and if you don't have a key, you can't get in. And the fire department has a key, but by the time they got there, they noticed my car was gone. They knew I had lived there. I was the only one there on the 9 acres. And they just let it burn because it's such a tight, narrow box canyon. By the time they got there, they would have been endangering themselves, is what they said. So everything burned, my home burned, but what's fascinating is none of the trees really burned. I really noticed all the sycamore, the willow, the palm trees, the eucalyptus. Very few of them really burned down. The tops of some of the pines burned, but really it looks like a beautiful park still, except for 11 burned buildings. The meadow has already come back. It's full of grass and clover already. The bulbs are coming up. But everything else is gone. So, that's my confession of naivety, because I probably would have stayed there, knowing me, if I had a hose and water, and I possibly could have cut it off, but I have my doubts, because it's a 400-foot hill, and it kind of came in all areas. The sad thing is, it's a legacy property. Fires come there in the past. The big swimming pool used to be covered, with a big building that burned in the early 1900s, maybe, I think. Not the 85 fire, long before that.
Maybe 1917.
Yeah, maybe 1917 a fire came in through there. So now it's gone. So we did lose a legacy property there, and the county has no plans to, resurrect it and turn it into a hot springs. The master plan has it as a parking lot for new trailheads once the dam comes down. So they'll take over the reservoir that's behind the dam, narrow it back down to the original stream size, and then have a parking lot of new trailheads, so people will park on that land and be able to start hiking into Matilha from there, right off the highway. So that's the master plan if the dam ever does come down. I left on Wednesday the 7th, I think.
Wednesday was the 6th.
The 6th. So Wednesday the 6th at about noon, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, I think, I left. 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 6 o'clock, I knew the fire was pretty far away, and the wind stopped, but that allowed the smoke to waft in, because it wasn't blowing the smoke away. And I started having some trouble breathing, and so I just grabbed my laptop and my camera and a small suitcase, and I had a full audio-video studio there, because that's my business. And was standing there going, okay, should I start loading my car? And I'm coughing, and I'm like going, the fire's way on the other end of the valley. I just know what this is, just smoke. And it didn't dawn on me where there's smoke, there's fire. But somehow I missed that adage as my reptilian brain kicked in and went, get out of here. So I left, and then, a few hours later, it came in. So in that way, it saved I saved my life probably, because I probably would have been trapped in that little narrow. There's one road in, and
There's no way out of that.
there's no way out of there.
Remember, you showed me your home about a year ago and showed me the dam, and there's no way out.
There's no way out. Yeah, it didn't jump the creek, so it was on that side. There's nowhere where it jumped. Because I had, believe it or not, I had a Motree hunting camera that I used as a security camera that was on about a 12-inch Norfolk pine. And the back of the pine was all charred, but the front wasn't. And my security camera and the SD card were fine, and it was pointing up my driveway. So I got 3,100 photographs from the 6th to the 11th, I think, or something. And so it shows the fire going in front of my gate, and then all these flames coming from the side, where the house was, but nothing coming from Creekside, so it didn't jump over the creek. It just came in through that, through the northeast.
It's appropriate, since we are at the museum, to note, with Ray and his home, and in a different way, Pat, with her records, the community, people lose their homes. It's tragic. Community also has lost a lot of history. Wheeler Hot Springs. Interestingly, the first 3 fires we're talking about started either at or near Wheeler. There's even talk of a curse. But Wheeler itself was never destroyed in 1917 or 48 or 85. This fire starts way the heck over there, but Wheeler's gone. Maybe the curse rebounded on it, because there's nothing left but the, if you ever went to Landucci's, which I never did, but that chimney in the fireplace, that's all that's left. So anyway, it's after 6, so I think, Peggy?
I just was hoping that Ray would speak to, as part of the planning commission, speak to building codes. I never heard about the barricade before, and while it sounds wonderful for retarding fire, I'm wondering what it does to the environment. And I think it's important that we start thinking about fire-resistant
This might be a good thing to spin forward into the fall.
Yeah.
Unless you have a quick comment.
Well, I have been very vocal since on my home and all the buildings are burned except for the 3 stone buildings. And I've been very vocal knowing that at the Ojai Foundation, it's the straw bale and the cob homes that didn't burn. And yet, it's illegal to build them. Straw bale's legal, but the permitting is still very expensive. But cob and super adobe don't burn. You need to protect your windows, but the structures themselves don't burn. And so in a environment such as we live in, to have building codes that allow for fire resistance and earthquake resilient buildings to be built is a must. The super adobe has been, and I won't explain what it is, but you can look up super adobe and Google that. That's been tested up to 8.4 on the Richter scale, as well as being fire resistant. I spoke to the county about this because they sent me an email saying they don't plan to rebuild. This is exactly what they wrote. We don't plan to rebuild, but we'd like to hear your ideas. Makes for some opens possibilities, also tenuous relationship, but I shared all this with them as what an opportunity there is to revise the building codes and to even build small models. I know Ray Serino just built a little cob home, and the kids helped them, so I could see building tabletop models and, one out of lumber and super adobe and cob and straw bale and torching them and see what,
We're going to do that at Earth Day. They're going to burn it at Earth Day.
Okay. So that's my thought on that, because I'm hoping people look in, since straw bale is legal in the county, that people that are rebuilding will look into straw bale structures. No, it's not just straw that burns. You're using the straw bale, which is great insulation, but then you're plastering it with a couple coats, and it's super thick and it's fire resistant. And it comes in at about $6 a square foot to build.
Sounds good to me. Well, I hope we'll learn more about this in detail in the fall. And we will again come back with an exhibit, and Peggy and the Art Center was going to be a whole bunch of stuff spun out of
Thank you.
what's been happening. Thank you, Ray. And thank you so much. Thank you all. And thank you Nadia and Alistair and Pat and Tony and Ann and all of you for coming. And well, we've all been through this, so.
Mark, you might point out that at ohistory.org, there are a lot of stories from the previous fires, posted by Drew and other people.
Oh, yes, ohistory.com, I think it actually is. Okay. We have a lot of fire stories from the past, and we'll be adding more, I'm sure. And Drew, I'm sure will be posting more. Drew Mashburn. All right, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel.